Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you a video that talks about some different ways and tips that you can use to increase the number of classics you read or help you get into classics if you've never really read any before. Now I think it's no secret in the book community that classics can sometimes take on a bit of a fabled, mythical, quite scary status. I think the current education system doesn't help with this, about how we kind of study classics in school, and they can become these kind of things that are either shunned as not worth the time or potentially quite intimidating to attempt to read. And I just wanted to talk today about a few things that I've found helpful over the past year or so to increase the number of classics that I've been reading. On my channel here I've gone from reading pretty much no classics in my kind of repertoire of reading taste to comfortably reading a couple each month. I'm really enjoying and looking forward to them and actively working them into my TBR. And I've done this through a variety of different ways, but I've just put together today like 5 tips that I think have been particularly helpful at like overcoming some of my kind of fear or reticence towards classics and helping me to pick the right classics for me. So for classics, the definition in this video, I'm not going to give a particularly strict definition. I guess this is kind of a mini freebie tip at the beginning that I would advise as well, that you don't necessarily be too strict on your definition if you are looking at trying to get into them now. There are some people who consider classics to be like pre-1950s, some who think they should be like 100 years old. There are some that have a specific cutoff point. Personally, as far as I'm concerned, if it is considered kind of like an archetype of its genre or is written, you know, a decent number of years ago, it's not something we would consider to be contemporary or maybe even considered like in my lifetime, then that's good enough for me. And I try not to get too strict on it because I think it's just going to be an arbitrary definition that is only going to work to exclude things. So if you consider it to be a classic, then I think it counts. And I think this way you can include certain things like, you know, a lot of the books that end up on the BBC 100 books you must read before you die, some of them are fairly modern, and I think that's completely okay. Tip number 1 for me is basically to know your genres and to pick within your preferred genre. So classic is really just a moniker that indicates that a book has been written within a certain period of time or has a certain amount of respect. However, it doesn't really indicate anything about the plot in particular or the style of book. So given that, it makes sense, given the huge range of classics out there, that if you're trying to get into them, I'd say focus on the ones that like most naturally link up to your already existing reading tastes. If you're the kind of person who reads a lot of magical realism, high fantasy, things like that, I really wouldn't recommend you go pick up an Austen or a Dickens because they're not exactly going to fulfill what you're looking for. You'd definitely be much better off with a Tolkien or maybe one of the sci-fi classics out there. And indeed the reverse is true. If you are really into your contemporaries, your romances, things like that, then probably don't pick up Tolkien or H.G. Wells. It's not going to do any of the stuff that you look for in a book, and so you're going to have a bad time with it. I'd say definitely avoid picking authors just for the sake of it, like because, you know, big names like Austen and Dickens and George Eliot and the Brontes and various things like that doesn't mean that you automatically have to read them. I'd say just stick with the ones that already appeal to you from a plot point of view. This kind of leads naturally into my second point, which is potentially a bit of antithesis to how we normally approach books, but I'd actually recommend that you do a bit of research about the plot and the storyline before you go into it. I do this quite often. I will watch I'll watch movies or like BBC miniseries about books before attempting them. I'm very keen on like adaptations and things like that, and I'll also do things like watch a lot of book reviews and indeed listen to podcasts on them to help me narrow down which ones I want to go for. And in some cases this involves spoiling the entire book for me, but it's not spoiled because actually for me it's not about the end goal, it's about the journey that we're going on. So a really great resource that I personally use for this is the wonderful guys over at the Overdue podcast. This is Andrew and Craig, and what they do is basically they pick books that you've been meaning to read. One of them will read them in a week and then tell the other one about it. Now this does involve going into massive spoilers in some cases for the ends and various things like that, but personally for me it's really helped me work out which classics I want to dedicate some time to and which ones really just don't sound like my cup of tea. And it's actually involved saving some classics from the chopping board for me. I was reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and having a really difficult time with it because I didn't like the narrator at all. But by listening to the Overdue podcast guys, I found out that actually it's a story within a story within a story, and a decent chunk of the book wasn't going to be from his perspective, so it was okay that I didn't particularly like him because we weren't going to have him for much longer. And that's the kind of thing that has saved that book and means that it's now, I wouldn't say it's a favourite, but I definitely really enjoyed reading it, and I'm really pleased that I now have that kind of, that in my canon of literature that I've read, and without the Overdue podcast I definitely wouldn't have stuck with it. But that's something which we probably don't normally do with your standard books. I think classics can be a little bit inaccessible, so knowing stuff like the plot beforehand can really help you work out if it's something that you want to stick with. Again, it's similar kind of link to this, would be tip number 3 for me would be checking out various adaptations or modern retellings, and this can be a really good way of inching your way into the classics. Not consciously, but definitely before I decided to read a lot of classics, I was definitely reading a decent number of retellings and sort of things that were inspired by, and I've definitely watched a lot of those as well. Some of my all-time favourite movies out there are ones that are actually directly inspired by or are like retellings of various famous Shakespeare plays and things like that. So for me, they're a really good way of getting familiar with the story, so that way when you then put it in the historical setting that you're going to be using that isn't going to be as familiar, and using various like historical language that we're not as familiar with, it's okay because you already know the storyline and some of the characters, so it's a bit easier to settle into it. It's not quite as jarring. My 4th tip would be audiobooks are your friend. Now this, or okay, to branch this one out a little bit more, different formats are your friend. For me personally, that does mean audiobooks, but I guess if you're not an audiobook listener, then this won't be very helpful, but consider ebooks as well. Basically what I'm saying is if the physical form of the book is a bit intimidating, change up how you're approaching it. I find audiobooks amazing for dealing with classics. I find, so there's definitely like a narrative form in various classics of specific time periods where dialogue was nowhere near as common and paragraph breaks weren't as common, and you get these really, really big chunks of text, and my brain just kind of like almost shuts down when I see those. I'm getting better at it. It's something which I've been working on as I've been reading them, but when confronted with that, I just start to skim read, and then I stop skim reading and I just start basically skipping pages, and I'm not getting what I need from the book. So I find for me audiobooks are an amazing way to basically force my brain to take in as much of the book as I possibly can, because the narrator isn't going to be skipping sentences like my brain will. So I find that audiobooks are amazing for helping me find classics far more accessible. I'd say ebooks can be really helpful as well. I don't know how much the audiobook is going to help you if you don't already listen to them and don't like them as a format, but I find that for big chunky classics, ebooks can be amazing because it just takes that size and shrinks it right down, and means that you're more likely to be able to put it in your like bag and then read it on the go, and also you're just kind of less intimidated because you don't realise quite how long you've got left in it. I'm definitely doing that for Vanity Fair. I've got a physical copy, but it's a brick. It's an absolute brick. Do I have it? I've been trying to read this all year. I picked it up a few times. It's terrifying. Like, I can't fit this in my handbag. I can't read it on the way to work. It's very irritating. So I've now just recently bought it on ebook. I say recently, a couple of months ago, and my plan is to hopefully try and get to it either by the end of this year or early next year, because I've now got a format that means that I can take it with me and it just looks less scary. And you know, it might be a little absurd to be intimidated by big books, but actually I think it's something that we all do. So if you can find ways around that, you might as well embrace them. And on a similar note, my last tip for you is get ones with pretty covers. Now, this might seem a little bit shallow, but to be honest, I think it works really, really well. So I'm going to show you 2 examples of the Picture of Dorian Gray that I have on my shelves. I've read the Picture of Dorian Gray a couple of years ago now, but I originally had this copy. Actually, I think this is my sister's old one. I don't know what happened to the copy I read. I literally read it like a decade ago now. But I recently bought myself this one. Now, if you were to look at them on the shelves, which one is more interesting and means that you're more likely to pick it up? This just screams to me homework at school, as far as I'm concerned, and it just brings back all of those kind of like reservations of reading the book because it's going to be something that you're going to be tested on, and it's really dull because it's schoolwork and like we're analysing too far, and just it completely puts my brain off. Whereas this is gorgeous and lovely and really nice to hold, and just means that I'm more likely to read it. And I've actually done this several times this year. I had my mum's old copy of Northanger Abbey, and I wasn't getting to it. I wasn't picking it up, and then by buying the Penguin English Library paperback, I like immediately started reading it and loved it. And it is the kind of thing that for me personally, they're my preferred format. But if you like the cloth bound ones, or you know, the Everyman's Libraries, or some of the many editions that are out there, we are all shallow creatures who do judge books by their covers, and if you can make them look less like homework and schoolwork, you're going to enjoy reading them more, or at least I personally do. And that's been one of the biggest changes to how I approach classics, is like treating myself to nice editions of them. Call me shallow, but hey. So this has been it from me. A bit of a short video, a bit of a strange video, one that I've not really done on this channel before. It's kind of like tips sort of style. If you want, because of my first tip point is to pick classics that fit within subgenres that you're interested in, I really am reluctant to do like a where to begin with classics video, because I think that's such a personal thing based on your own reading. So I wouldn't want to do that, but I might do like the classics book tag, or maybe some of my favourite classics at some point towards the end of the year. And if you'd like either of those, do comment down below. Also, if you are interested in getting into classics and you're looking for some amazing channels for where to start, because I really do think taking your time, putting in a bit of research and looking at reviews and other people's reading to see where to start is really helpful, I will link down below some absolutely amazing YouTubers who do read a lot of classics in their kind of catalogue of books and do talk about them quite often. There's probably going to be a good 5 or 6 down there, and if you are somebody who reads a lot of classics and would like your channel to be your channel features them quite prominently and you'd like to be known for that, please comment down below. I'm always on the lookout for more channels that do this, because I just think it's a section of booktube that is growing and has its own little kind of pocket, but is not one that is big enough for me personally, and I know there must be more people out there. So comment everything down below and I will chat to you soon. Have a wonderful reading week. Bye guys.